In a world of glittering facades and elaborate masks, what lies beneath is often far more sinister than the costumes we choose to wear. Imagine a grand victory ball, a kaleidoscope of color and champagne-fueled laughter celebrating the end of the Great War. 6 friends, a vibrant troupe dressed as characters from the classic Commedia dell'arte, become the heart of the party. Their leader, the young and wealthy Viscount Cronshaw, is the life of the celebration, his laughter echoing through the grand hall. But as the night wears on, the laughter fades, replaced by a chilling silence. Lord Cronshaw is found dead, a dinner knife plunged into his heart in a private room, alone. How does a man die in plain sight, yet unseen? The police are baffled, seeing only a tragic, inexplicable end to a joyous night. But to Hercule Poirot, this is not a random act of violence. It is a performance, a carefully staged play, where the costumes are not just for show, but are the very instruments of deception. He sees a web of jealousy, secrets, and a psychological game so cunning its solution is hidden within the fabric of the masks themselves.
The 6 Merry Makers. It was a night painted in the artificial colors of relief. London. The Victory Ball was more than just a party. It was a collective sigh, a frantic attempt to dance away the ghosts of the recent past. I, Captain Hastings, found myself swept up in the glittering tide, the air thick with perfume, champagne, and a desperate, almost manic gaiety. The Royal Albert Hall was transformed into a chaotic canvas of color and sound, a sea of costumes where identities were shed as easily as coats at the door. And in the heart of this dazzling vortex, one group shone brighter, laughed louder, and commanded more attention than any other. They were a set of 6, a living tableau of the Italian Commedia dell'arte, their costumes immaculate, their energy infectious. They were led by the young Viscount Cronshaw, a man whose fortune was as well known as his charm. He was a dashing harlequin, his costume a riot of colored diamonds, a figure of pure, untroubled joy. By his side, clinging to his arm, was his fiancée, the American actress Coco Courtney. As Columbine, she was a vision of delicate beauty, her every movement a study in theatrical grace. It was whispered she had a fondness for cocaine, a rumor that seemed to add a dangerous, tragic allure to her persona. Then there was Chris Davidson, a jovial actor perfectly cast as the mischievous Punchinello, with his wife at his side as a vibrant Pulcinella. Completing the troupe were the Restorics, he a mournful white-clad Pierrot, and she a matching pensive Pierrette. Together they were the epitome of aristocratic bohemia, a self-contained universe of inside jokes and shared histories. Yet, as I watched them from a distance, I couldn't shake a subtle sense of unease. Their performance of happiness felt just that, a performance. Beneath the painted smiles and boisterous laughter, there seemed to be a current of something else, something fragile and tense. I saw it in the way Coco's grip on Cronshaw's arm seemed less like affection and more like a desperate anchor. I saw it in the way Mr. Restorick, even in his jovial moments, never quite lost the melancholy look of his Pierrot mask. Later in the evening, I had a brief conversation with Cronshaw. He was complaining about the heat, the press of the crowd. "It's all a bit much, isn't it?" he said, his voice unusually subdued. He then leaned in, a strange, almost feverish look in his eyes. "You know, Hastings," he murmured, "I've been thinking about reincarnation, about the souls of butterflies and the sting of a wasp." He tapped the side of his nose. "Sometimes the most beautiful things have the sharpest sting." The comment was so bizarre, so out of place amid the thumping music and joyful chaos, that I simply smiled and nodded, dismissing it as the rambling of a man who'd had too much champagne. I never could have imagined that this nonsensical whisper was in fact a prelude to death.
The curtain falls. As the clock hands crept towards the early hours of the morning, the vibrant energy of the Victory Ball began to fray at the edges. The relentless cheerfulness had exhausted itself, leaving a residue of fatigue and smeared makeup. The great hall, once a symphony of motion, was now dotted with wilting flowers and discarded streamers, like a battlefield after a joyous war. I saw the Commedia dell'arte troupe gathering their things near the exit, their movements now lacking the synchronized grace they had possessed earlier. They were preparing to move on to a private supper, but an air of discord seemed to hang over them. Coco Courtney appeared particularly distressed, her face pale beneath her makeup, her gestures sharp and frantic. She was speaking in a low, urgent tone to Cronshaw, who simply shook his head, a look of weary stubbornness on his face. The others waited, their costumed figures looking strangely out of place in the thinning crowd. Finally, Cronshaw waved them on. "You all go ahead," he announced, his voice loud enough for me to overhear. "I'll join you in a bit. There's someone I must speak to." Chris Davidson, the boisterous Punchinello, clapped him on the shoulder and led the rest of the group away, leaving their harlequin standing alone. Cronshaw watched them go, a pensive, almost lost expression on his face, before turning and walking towards one of the private supper boxes overlooking the main floor. I assumed he was meeting an acquaintance and thought little more of it, turning my own attention to finding my coat and escaping the cloying atmosphere. Time dissolved, as it often does at the end of a long night. I found myself in conversation with an old army colleague, reminiscing about times that felt a world away from this hollow festivity. It might have been half an hour, perhaps closer to an hour, when a new current rippled through the remaining guests. It wasn't a shout, but a murmur, a creeping whisper that was somehow more alarming. "There's been an accident. Someone's been hurt in one of the boxes." The whispers grew, pulling people towards the east side of the hall, where a small group of officials now stood guard, their faces grim. The music had faltered and died, leaving an unnatural silence, broken only by the shuffling of feet and the rising hum of speculation. I felt a cold dread creep up my spine, a premonition I couldn't explain. A senior police officer arrived, his purposeful stride cutting through the confused assembly.
He disappeared into the box, and when he emerged moments later, his expression confirmed the worst. He spoke to one of the ball's organizers, his voice low but carrying in the stillness. "It's Viscount Cronshaw." The words reached me, stripped of all emotion. "He's been stabbed, dead." The chaotic, colorful, desperate performance of the Victory Ball was over. The curtain had fallen, not on applause, but on a single, silent corpse.
The little grey cells. The following morning, London felt grey and hungover, the city's mood perfectly mirroring my own. I returned to our rooms to find Hercule Poirot in a state of perfect contentment, arranging his toast on his plate with geometric precision. The contrast between his serene, ordered world and the chaotic, violent images replaying in my mind was jarring. He looked up, his head tilted slightly, and his sharp eyes immediately registered my disheveled state. "Ah, Hastings," he began, a hint of disapproval in his tone. "You appear to have wrestled with the night, and I fear the night has won." I collapsed into a chair, waving away his offer of coffee, and the whole sordid story came tumbling out. The dazzling ball, the 6 costumed friends, the strange, disjointed conversation with Cronshaw, and the final grim discovery in the supper box. For a time, Poirot listened with an air of polite detachment, his attention seemingly fixed on the alignment of his jam pot. But when I began to describe the Commedia dell'arte costumes in detail, and when I recounted Cronshaw's bizarre final words about butterflies and the sting of a wasp, I saw a flicker of interest in his eyes, a spark. By the time I explained the impossible nature of the crime, a man stabbed with a common table knife, alone in a room, with no sign of a struggle and no apparent killer, the spark had become a familiar, intense gleam. He placed his knife and fork together, his breakfast forgotten. The little grey cells had been stirred from their slumber. "So," he mused, more to himself than to me, "the police, they are running in circles, yes? They search for a madman, a thief, a jealous lover who can walk through walls, perhaps?" I told him that Inspector Japp was on the case, and that the prevailing theory was that it was connected to Coco Courtney and her rumored association with cocaine dealers. Poirot made a sound of supreme disdain, a soft pah of dismissal. He began to pace the room, his short stride filled with a sudden vibrant energy. "No, no, no, my friend. They look for the motive in the gutter when it is performing on the stage. This is not a crime of passion in the typical sense. It is a crime of theater, of psychology." He stopped and turned to me, his eyes alight with intellectual fire. He began peppering me with questions that seemed utterly bizarre. The pompon on Pierrot's costume, Hastings, was it white or black? And Punchinello, describe to me the shape of his hat. This dinner knife, it was an ordinary knife, you are certain? Nothing remarkable about it at all? I confessed I hadn't paid such close attention to these trivialities. He sighed dramatically. "You see, but you do not observe. The police will search for fingerprints on the knife. I, Hercule Poirot, will search for the logic in the costumes. The solution to this affair, my dear Hastings, is not a matter of criminology, but of choreography. We must speak to the 5 remaining actors in this sad little play." The Tragic Columbine. Our investigation began, as it must, with the woman at the heart of the affair, Miss Coco Courtney. We found her in her lavish Mayfair flat, a space that felt more like a stage set than a home.
It was a chaotic shrine to a public sorrow, overwhelmed with enormous bouquets of funereal flowers whose cloying scent mingled with the faint smell of spilt powder and stale cigarette smoke. She received us from a chaise lounge, a tragic figure wrapped in black silk and grief. She was undeniably beautiful, but it was a strained, fragile beauty. Her face pale, and her eyes, though red-rimmed from crying, darting about with a nervous energy that grief alone could not explain. She clutched a lace handkerchief in her hand, dabbing at her eyes with a theatricality that felt both profound and practiced. Poirot was the very picture of gentle sympathy. He offered his condolences in a soft, murmuring voice, positioning himself not as an interrogator, but as a kindly confidant who had come to help her navigate her terrible loss. "Mademoiselle," he began, "I will not trouble you for long, but to catch the man who did this terrible thing, I must understand the events of that night. Not the facts, the police have those, but the feeling, the atmosphere." He encouraged her to speak of the ball, of the happiness of the evening before it was shattered. She spoke in a broken, whispery voice, recounting how wonderful everything had been, how happy she and Victor, Lord Cronshaw, were. Her performance was compelling. Even I, who had witnessed her frantic argument with the victim, found my heart going out to her. Poirot then gently guided the conversation to the costumes. "They were magnificent," he said, "a perfect illusion. Did you feel, perhaps, that you were Columbine that night?" She managed a weak, watery smile. "We all did. For a few hours we weren't ourselves. We were just figures from a story." Poirot then leaned forward slightly. "And the argument, mademoiselle, the little moment of friction before you left?" Her body tensed. The tragic mask slipped for a fraction of a second, replaced by a flicker of fear. "It was nothing," she insisted, a little too quickly. "A silly quarrel. I was tired. I wanted to go to supper. Victor could be stubborn. He wanted to stay. That's all it was." She looked away, twisting the handkerchief in her hands. Poirot did not press. Instead, he deftly changed the subject, murmuring about the pressures of a public life, the cruel gossip of the newspapers. He mentioned the rumors of cocaine, not as an accusation, but as another burden she had to bear. Her reaction was instantaneous and fierce. "Lies!" she hissed, her eyes flashing with genuine anger. "All of it lies spread by jealous people. Victor hated that sort of thing. It had nothing to do with us."
The 4 remaining masks. Our next step was to convene the rest of the players in this grim theatrical production. We met with the Davidsons and the Restoricks in the Davidsons' comfortable, if somewhat bohemian, Kensington flat. The 4 of them sat together on a large sofa, a united front of grief and suspicion. The boisterous energy I had witnessed at the ball was gone, replaced by a heavy, watchful silence. Chris Davidson, the once jovial Punchinello, was now a man simmering with a quiet rage. His wife, a quiet and observant woman, watched us with nervous eyes. The Restoricks, who had been cast as the tragic clowns Pierrot and Pierrette, seemed to have fully inhabited their roles. A profound and genuine sadness radiated from them, so much so that it felt almost like an accusation. They had lost a friend, and now they were faced with the indignity of our questions. Poirot, ever the master of social navigation, did not begin with an interrogation. Instead, he spoke of friendship, of loyalty, and of the terrible shock they must all be feeling. He positioned himself as their ally.
someone who sought only to bring justice for their murdered companion. Slowly, they began to relax, to open up. He asked them to walk him through the evening, to describe their shared experience. Their stories were largely consistent, a tapestry of laughter and champagne that frayed into confusion and horror. They all confirmed seeing the brief, tense exchange between Coco and Cronshaw. But, like Coco, they dismissed it as a fleeting lover spat, a common occurrence in a passionate relationship. They all remembered Cronshaw insisting he would stay behind for a short while before joining them for supper. None of them could imagine why. Then Poirot's line of questioning took a turn that I, and clearly the others, found baffling. He became intensely interested in the costumes. They were works of art, he proclaimed with genuine admiration. I must know who was the artist behind them, who designed such perfection. Mrs. Davidson explained that they had all had a hand in the design, basing them on old prints, and had them made by a theatrical costumier. Poirot nodded, his eyes gleaming. And the details, they were precise, yes? The traditional details? They all confirmed that they were. Then he turned to Mr. Restorick. "Your costume, Monsieur Poirot," he said, "it had the large black pompons down the front, did it not?" Restorick, looking confused, confirmed that it did. "And yours, Monsieur Davidson, as Punchinello, your costume was white, with a ruff and a pointed hat, but the pompons were of a different color, yes?" Davidson frowned. "They were red and green, I think, or perhaps black. Does it really matter?" "Oh, it matters a great deal," Poirot said softly, a statement that hung in the air, dense with unspoken meaning. As we took our leave, I confessed my frustration to Poirot. "We learned nothing, Poirot. A few details about costumes. What good is that?" Poirot stopped on the pavement and looked at me, a triumphant smile playing on his lips. "Au contraire, my dear Hastings, we have learned everything. They have, in their innocence, described the exact mechanics of the murder. They believe they were describing a costume ball, but they were in fact detailing the workings of an ingenious machine of death. The key is not in who had a motive, but in who had the right pompons." The second tragedy. For the next day, Poirot was in a state of intense, almost unnerving calm. He had transformed our sitting room into a war room of the mind, though the only weapons were his notes. Scraps of paper detailing the colors of pompons, sketches of the Commedia dell'arte characters, and a floor plan of the Royal Albert Hall were arranged on the dining table in patterns that were, to me, utterly meaningless. He would move a note, stand back and murmur to himself, a general planning a silent, intellectual battle. My own patience was wearing thin. The vibrant, violent reality of the murder felt a world away from this pedantic obsession with costume details. I was about to voice my frustration when a heavy, frantic knock fell upon our door. It was Inspector Japp, his usually ruddy face pale, his posture heavy with grim news. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. "It's the actress," he said, his voice flat. "Coco Courtney. She's dead." I was stunned into silence. Japp went on to explain that her maid had found her that morning in her flower-filled flat, the tragic Columbine having taken her final bow. An overdose of cocaine. On her bedside table was a small, empty enamel box, and a newspaper clipping detailing the inquest into Lord Cronshaw's death. The conclusion, Japp said, was almost foregone. Suicide. A grief-stricken fiancée, hounded by the press and her own demons, had chosen a permanent escape. It was a neat, if profoundly sad, end to the affair. Japp seemed almost relieved to have a plausible, self-contained tragedy to present to his superiors. For my part, I felt a wave of sorrow and guilt. We had misjudged her, I thought. Her grief was real, after all, a bottomless despair that had ultimately consumed her. But Poirot's reaction was something else entirely. He did not look sad. He did not look surprised. He looked furious. A cold, controlled anger tightened his features, and his eyes became like chips of green ice. "Imbeciles," he whispered, the word sharp and venomous. "You see a suicide. I, Hercule Poirot, see a second murder, committed with a coward's weapon." Japp began to protest, but Poirot cut him off, his voice charged with a sudden fierce energy. "Do you not see how convenient it is, my friend? The central figure, the woman who connects the victim to a world of scandal and drugs, is silenced. The case is closed. The police can write their reports, and the true killer can dissolve back into the shadows. But they have made a fatal error." He began to pace, his movements like a caged panther. This was not an act of despair. This was an act of calculation. Miss Courtney was a danger to the killer, not because of what she had done, but because of what she knew, or perhaps what she was beginning to suspect. They did not kill her because she was guilty. They killed her because she was the one person who could prove that they were. The air in the room crackled with his intensity. The game had changed. This was no longer just a clever puzzle. It was a hunt for a ruthless artist of death who had just painted their second masterpiece.
A box of enamel. Poirot insisted we visit Coco Courtney's flat at once. Japp, though skeptical of the murder theory, could not refuse a request from the man who so often proved him wrong. We returned to the Mayfair apartment, but the scene had been cruelly transformed. The cloying scent of dying flowers now mingled with the cold metallic odor of a police investigation. What had been a stage for dramatic grief was now just a room, stripped of its mystique, where a young woman's life had ended. Uniformed constables moved with a grim purpose, their presence a stark violation of the apartment's carefully curated glamour. The narrative of suicide was already hardening into official fact. While Japp conferred with his men, Poirot ignored the official proceedings entirely. He moved through the room with a quiet, almost reverent grace, his eyes taking in everything. He was not looking for evidence in the way a policeman would. He was reading the story of Coco's final hours. He noted the half-read novel on a chair, the placement of the newspaper clipping on the bedside table, the overturned glass. To him, these were not just items on a list, but the final, silent words of the victim. His attention, however, soon settled on a single object, the small, ornate enamel box that the police had labeled as the source of the fatal dose. It lay on a pristine evidence cloth, its delicate painted surface seeming to mock the grim reality of its function. Japp dismissed it with a wave of his hand. "Just a fancy snuff box she used for a powder. We'll trace it, but it'll lead back to some dealer in a back alley, and he'll have an alibi, a dead end. But Poirot was transfixed. He picked it up with a gloved hand, his touch infinitely gentle. He examined its intricate floral design, its delicate clasp, its weight. It was a beautiful, expensive thing. He then approached the distraught maid, who was weeping quietly in a corner. "Mademoiselle," his voice soft as velvet, "this little box, it was precious to Miss Courtenay, yes?" The maid nodded, choking back a sob. "Oh, yes, sir. She carried it everywhere. It was a gift." Poirot's eyes sharpened. "A recent gift?" The maid thought for a moment. "Yes, sir. Just last week. She said it was from Lord Cronshaw." A profound stillness fell over Poirot. He looked from the maid to the box, and in that moment I knew he had seen something that we had all missed. He turned the box over in his hand, his expression one of dawning, terrible comprehension. The police saw a container for poison. Jap saw a link to a faceless drug dealer. But Poirot saw a message. He saw a chilling connection, a piece of a puzzle that bridged two deaths. He turned to me, his voice barely a whisper, yet it cut through the sterile hum of the room. "They say dead men tell no tales, Hastings, but this little box tells us a great deal. It tells us that our killer does not just remove their obstacles, they mock them. They have used the victim's own love token as the instrument of her death. This is not the work of a common criminal. This is the work of a poet, a dark and terrible poet."
The logic of a costume. We returned to Baker Street in a silence thick with unspoken questions. I was more lost than ever, grappling with the image of that small enamel box and what it signified. Poirot, however, was possessed by a chilling clarity. The second death had not muddied the waters for him, it had made them crystal clear. He stood before the fireplace, his notes now discarded, the entire case seemingly arranged to his satisfaction within his own mind. "You are troubled, Hastings," he said, not looking at me. "You see two separate tragedies. A man murdered, a woman who takes her own life. You must learn to see with the eyes of order. There is only one tragedy. One story with two victims." He finally turned to face me, his expression more serious than I had ever seen it. "It is time," he announced, "that I explain to you the profound significance of a pompon." He took a sheet of paper and drew a simple sketch of two figures. "Here," he said, pointing to the first, "we have Poirot, a sad clown in a loose white tunic, and, most importantly, down the front he has three large black pompons. Mr. Restorick confirmed this. It is traditional." He then pointed to the second figure. "And here we have Harlequin, a dashing figure in a costume of tight-fitting, multicolored diamonds, the costume of Lord Cronshaw." He looked at me expectantly. "Now think, Hastings. The police report. It mentions something very peculiar. Lord Cronshaw was stabbed through the heart, but there was no corresponding hole in his costume. They assumed the killer lifted the tunic, stabbed him, and replaced it. A clumsy, unlikely action, no?" I agreed that it had always struck me as odd. "Precisely," Poirot exclaimed, "because that is not what happened at all. The police have made a fundamental error. They have misidentified the victim." I stared at him, utterly bewildered.
"The man found dead in the supper box, Hastings," Poirot continued, his voice dropping to a dramatic whisper, "was not Lord Cronshaw." He let the statement hang in the air. It was Mr. Restorick, the mournful Poirot. He then laid out the logic, and it was so simple, so audacious, that I felt my mind reel. After the others left, Cronshaw and Restorick swapped costumes. It was Restorick, dressed as Harlequin, who went to wait in the box, and it was Cronshaw, now disguised as Poirot, who followed him. The loose costume of Poirot would be the perfect place to conceal a common dinner knife. He enters the box, he strikes, and then he performs his masterstroke. Poirot leaned in, his eyes blazing with the thrill of intellectual discovery. How to hide the wound on the tight Harlequin costume? He simply plucks one of the large black pompons from his own Poirot costume and affixes it over the fatal wound. In the dim light, on a costume of so many colors, a single dark pompon would not look amiss. It would appear to be part of the design. It is neat, it is clever, and it is quintessentially theatrical. The police were looking for a hole when they should have been looking for a pompon. The puzzle of the physical murder was solved, but in its place stood a far more terrifying question. If the dead man was Restorick, then where was Lord Cronshaw? And why had he committed such a monstrous, elaborate act of deception?
The psychology of a wasp. The revelation that Restorick was the true victim left me speechless, but my mind was still a tangle of unanswered questions. But why, Poirot? I finally managed to ask. Why would Cronshaw go to such monstrous lengths? To kill his friend, to fake his own death, and then to arrange the death of the woman he was supposed to love? It's the work of a madman. Poirot shook his head slowly, a grim look on his face. Not madness, Hastings, something far more dangerous, wounded vanity. Do you recall the strange words Cronshaw spoke to you at the ball, the words I dismissed at the time as nonsense? He paused, letting me remember. The souls of butterflies and the sting of a wasp. It was not the rambling of a drunk, my friend. It was a confession. He began to piece together the dark psychology of the crime, and a truly monstrous picture emerged. Lord Cronshaw, a man of wealth, title, and immense pride, had discovered an unbearable truth. His beautiful, delicate fiancée, Coco Courtney, the butterfly, was not in love with him. She was secretly in love with his quiet, unassuming friend, Mr. Restorick. Theirs was a hidden affair, a deep emotional betrayal conducted right under his nose. For a man like Cronshaw, this was more than just heartbreak. It was a profound humiliation. It was the sting of a wasp, a sharp, venomous wound to his ego that festered into a desire for a uniquely cruel and theatrical revenge. His plan was diabolical in its artistry, Poirot continued, his voice low. He would not simply kill them, he would erase them, and in doing so, author a perfect, tragic narrative with himself as the victim. First, he murders Restorick, but he does it while making the world believe that he, Lord Cronshaw, is the one who has died. It is the ultimate insult. Restorick will be buried under another man's name, mourned by a world that does not even know he is gone. His very existence is blotted out. Then his attention turned to Coco. He allows her to grieve, knowing full well that her public tears for Victor are private, agonized tears for her secret, murdered love. It is a form of exquisite psychological torture. After letting her suffer, he delivers the final mocking blow. Poirot picked up his notes on the enamel box.
He has her killed, poisoned with the very love token he once gave her, framing her death as the tragic suicide of a drug-addled, heartbroken girl. He destroys her reputation as thoroughly as he destroyed her life. But he could not have done it alone. A plan this elaborate required a stagehand. And that, Poirot concluded, is where the jovial Punchinello comes in, Mr. Chris Davidson. A struggling actor, a man easily impressed by wealth, and a loyal friend to Cronshaw. It was Davidson who procured the cocaine. It was Davidson who, under the guise of offering comfort, administered the fatal dose to the distraught Miss Courtney. Cronshaw was the architect of this tragedy, but Davidson was his willing executioner. The entire affair was now laid bare, not a simple murder, but a meticulously scripted revenge play born from the mind of a man who could not bear to be the fool.
The wasp in the web. All that remained was to spring the trap. But our quarry, Lord Cronshaw, had vanished from the earth, officially dead and buried. "Where do we find a ghost, Poirot?" I asked, but he simply smiled. "A man like Cronshaw does not truly disappear, Hastings. His ego is too large. He would need to remain close, to admire his own handiwork, to read the newspapers that detail his own tragic demise." A few discreet inquiries into the properties owned or recently rented by Chris Davidson led us to an unassuming block of flats in a quiet, forgettable corner of London. It was the perfect hiding place, a drab curtain from behind which the master puppeteer could watch his final act play out. We ascended the stairs with Jap and two of his constables, a silent, grim procession. It was Davidson himself who answered the door. The moment he saw us, his forced, casual smile evaporated, and his face, the face of the comical Punchinello, seemed to collapse into a mask of pure terror. He offered no resistance as we stepped past him. And there, sitting in an armchair by the window, reading a newspaper, was Viscount Cronshaw. He was dressed not in the finery of his class, but in the simple clothes of a common man. He looked up, and upon seeing Poirot, he showed no fear, no surprise. Instead, a slow, appreciative smile spread across his lips. It was the look of a grand master acknowledging a worthy opponent across the chessboard. Poirot did not waste time with accusations. He simply began to speak, his voice calm and even, as he laid out the entire sordid affair. He spoke of the secret love between Coco and Restorick, of Cronshaw's wounded pride, and of the bizarre conversation at the ball. He detailed the swapping of the costumes, the function of the black pompon, the murder of Restorick, and the subsequent cruel poisoning of Coco with the enamel box. He laid every card on the table, not as a detective presenting evidence, but as a critic reviewing a grotesque and immoral play. Throughout the recital, Chris Davidson wept silently, his guilt a palpable presence in the room. Cronshaw, however, listened with an air of detached pride, as if hearing an ode to his own genius. When Poirot finished, there was a long silence. "Bravo, Monsieur Poirot," Cronshaw said finally, his voice smooth and utterly without remorse. "I confess I did not think anyone would look past the obvious." He spoke of the murders as if they were artistic choices, of his victims as if they were treacherous characters who had been written out of the script. "They betrayed me," he said with a shrug.
An artist must have his integrity. My little play required a more satisfying ending." At this, Davidson finally broke, sobbing out a full confession, corroborating every detail Poirot had presented, his words painting a pathetic picture of a weak man caught in the orbit of a charismatic monster. Japp stepped forward and placed a hand on Cronshaw's shoulder. The Wasp, so pleased with the cleverness of his own web, had not realized it had been woven inside a cage. As they led him away, he looked back at Poirot and gave a slight, almost imperceptible bow, one artist acknowledging another, before disappearing forever from the stage.
In the end, the affair at the Victory Ball was never truly about a simple act of murder. It was about the terrifying power of a wounded ego and the elaborate masks we wear to conceal the truths we cannot bear. A night that was meant to celebrate the end of a world war became the private battlefield for one man's vanity. Lord Cronshaw was not a mere killer. He was a dark artist, a playwright who cast his friends as victims in a tragedy of his own design. He valued the perfection of his narrative far more than the sanctity of human life, sacrificing two souls to preserve his own pride. The glittering costumes, the joyful music, the champagne, it was all a backdrop for a horror born not of madness, but of a cold, calculating intellect. This case serves as a chilling reminder that the most beautiful surfaces can hide the most profound darkness, and that the most dangerous monsters are often the ones who see themselves as the heroes of their own twisted stories. The sting of a wasp, as Cronshaw said, is a small thing, but its venom can rot the soul from within. Thank you for joining me on this journey into one of Hercule Poirot's most theatrical and psychologically complex cases. If you appreciate these deep dives into the mysteries of the human heart, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. I'd be fascinated to read your thoughts in the comments below. Was Cronshaw's revenge a work of genius, or simply the desperate act of a pathetic man? Until next time, look closely at the masks people wear. You never know what lies behind them.